Greetings. Let's understand critical review of literature. The question that comes to our mind is how to do it right. Because there are so many papers that do it in different ways. But before we do all this critical review, we need to understand what exactly is review and what exactly is critique. According to Oxford Dictionary, a review can be in two forms. One is noun, another one is verb. So if it's a noun, it's a report in an outlet in which somebody gives their opinion of a book, play, film, product, paper, etc. However, as a verb, it is to read or study information about something, especially in order to reach an opinion about it. So when we see a review paper or a review article, it's a noun, but to do it is a verb. Now, what is critique? So according to Wernick and Loretti, 2018, a critique may have different dimensions. It could have metamoral dimensions, aesthetic dimensions, or logical dimensions. For our purpose in business management, it is one of the parts of aesthetic dimensions and all the parts of logical dimensions that matter. So, business management critical review or critique involves presentation of the imagined utopia. It also has an inbuilt definition of what exactly is critique. So, when we talk about presentation of imagined utopia, we mainly try to say what is the difference between what exists and what we imagine that it should be there. So, the difference between the observed and the expected state of a particular entity. That is critique. When it comes to logical dimensions, these are concerned with the logical, formal, cognitive nature of critique. So these include degree of objectivity, intelligibility, and tangibility of proof. Let's understand these one by one. So as I said before, presentation of imagined utopia is a comparison between how the world is, that is, you identify a problem in that particular world, and how the world should be. So that means the solution to that problem. But how did you really do it? You can answer this if you ask the right question. And that right question can be gouged from MEDA 2009. Critique Me, please, Harvard Business Review article. It's a very good practitioner based article. And the question that they ask is, does it pose an interesting question about the way we live? So you'll be able to answer and do things about the critique only when you answer, does it pose an interesting question about the way we live? That means, what is the current situation? That is what way we live. And what is your question relating to that? That is identifying a problem. The next is the direct or objectivity dimension. It is the degree of detail with which the problem is presented. So it mainly deals with the specificity of the problem. So, how much in detail do you describe the problem? The more you describe the problem, the clearer it becomes. And which means you have to answer this question, will the work lead to advancement in a certain field? Okay, so directly you have to attack this question and it has to be as objective, that means in detail, as possible. The next is intelligibility. Intelligibility has to do with when users read your review, do they find you that you have done some intelligible work? Which means, have you really thought through about it? So it is a critique needs to be comprehended. That means, have you understood it well? Not only from a cognitive point of view, but also in a contextual and moral sense. So yes, intuitively, your cognition tells you, your thinking tells you that yes, it is important, but in a particular context, it might not necessarily be important, or it might not be making a moral sense. Okay, so we have to see a particular theory, okay, a particular theory from context and moral sense as well. The question that you need to answer is the presentation demonstrating expertise in skill. So here we are talking about the skill of the presenter. Okay, that means you. That means the author. Next is tangibility of the proof. That means whether you have a rigorous process for doing that critical review, okay, or critique. So there has to be defined methods that ensure its low degree of subjectivity and consequently its legitimacy as proof its justness. Okay, so have you involved a systematic method of critique? That's very important. Now let's understand how do you really do critical review. There are 6 steps in which you have to do it. The number one step is who is the center of entire discourse. Now, when we say who, I'll give you an example given by Kuliberg and Mihalik 2017 of whistleblowing. So they have done a critical review of whistleblowing and they had published an article in Journal of Business Ethics. They followed a very systematic approach of critical review. And that's why we are going to discuss their approach here. So the first thing they did was the answer to the question of who. That means from whose perspective are we looking that particular literature review. Okay, so there could be several people involved. For example, in whistleblowing, the whistleblower is involved. The person to whom whistle is blown is involved. The immediate supervisor might be involved. Organization is involved. Government might be involved. Society might be involved if it is to the external people. So there are different stakeholders and perspectives involved. So discuss how literature has focused on different perspectives relating to, for example, whistleblowing, but narrow down in the end to just one. For example, Kaliberg and Mihalik 2017, Kaliberg and Mihalik 2017 focused on whistleblowers' perspective. So though they discussed about all the perspectives in the beginning, but then they focused especially on whistleblowers' perspective. And that was their critique in the direction for future research as well, that there are less studies on this perspective. The second step is answering the question, what are the characteristics of the focal concept? So the question, what is important? Now we know that the concept is whistleblowing in this example. So you have to discuss all the confusions and inconsistencies in the conceptual and operational definitions of the focal concepts. For example, whistleblowing in our case. Here, you also have to mention the different directions for further research, and these research directions will come from the inconsistencies whether it is in the conceptualization or in the measurement scales. The third step is the answering of the question how the different elements of a focal concept form a phenomenon. So if there is a process involved, discuss all the steps in the focal concept. Remember, this is very important thing in case of answering how. You have to merge the focal concept with the relevant field of the study. For example, in whistleblowing, the authors merge the concept of whistleblowing with ethical decision making process. So they had merged this whistleblowing with the ethics literature. Okay, and this is what you have to do. And in the end, of course, you'll have to mention directions for future research. Next comes doing a critical review. You have to have the answer of why the focal concept occurs. So, what are the different factors that would affect, or the antecedents that would affect the focal concept? So, divide the antecedents into individual, situational, and environmental factors. As the paper has done, we can also divide these factors into individual, situational, and environmental factors because these tell exactly why a particular focal concept occurs. So, this why also involves mentioning the possible theories that connect the focal concept with the antecedents. Of course, in the end, you have to mention directions relating to theory, the possible antecedents which have not been either tested or the results were inconsistent or they have never been conceptualized but they make sense according to the theory. The last step, however, is to whom does it matter? So, whom will the focal concept affect? So, here we are talking about basically the consequences of that focal concept. So, divide the focal concepts based on the type of affective stakeholder into internal or external to the organization. For example, it could be a turnover rate, HR turnover rate. So it is an HR turnover rate, it affects the company. So it is internal to the company. But if you are talking about GDP of a country, if it affects GDP of the country, then it is external to the organization. And of course, mention directions for future research based on the critique that you had done earlier. So I hope this video helped you in understanding exactly what is review, what is critique, and how do you do critical review. The link of the paper would be mentioned in the description section. Thank you.